refuge is also really important for species like moose and muskox and bear and caribou, which are all subsistence species and also highly sought after by sports hunters.
What about wolves?
There are wolves, yeah. I don't remember them being in any sort of high number, but on the other side of the Kuskokwim, when we would do the moose surveys, we would usually see black bear, which weren't super common, and then there were wolves in more wooded areas. And then they have a huge fisheries component. Lots of controversy over, the Kuskokwim salmon and stuff, so they have a really big fisheries component on the refuge, so super important for that as well.
That's a great one.
So there are 2 threatened species on the delta. The first is the Steller's eider, which was listed as threatened in 1997 due to some pretty drastic declines seen in its breeding population. And the other species is the spectacle eider, which is the one that I kind of focused a lot of my efforts on. So they were listed in 1993 for some of very similar reasons, one being a drastic decline in their breeding population. So between the 70s and the early 90s, they saw a 96% decline in breeding pairs of spectacle eiders. And so that led to the listing in 1993, which then instilled a recovery team, which came up with a recovery plan for the species. So they laid out a bunch of different priorities, where were the data gaps, where were the concerns, and started to lead some of the research efforts to figure out more about the species and also set goals of recovery. So one of the reasons for the decline in the species is lead poisoning. They are actually still finding lead on the delta today, and it's actually being ingested by the eiders that are dabbling in these ponds. And so they started finding it in their stomachs and actually in their bloodstreams. And so in high doses, it can kill adults, and it can obviously kill ducklings as well. The other concern were predators. There's actually not a lot known about the predator-prey relationships on this portion of the delta. They know that there's fox and gulls and gators, but how they all connect, there's definitely a bull component, and when bulls are high, other things are high. When bulls are low, other things are low, but how it all kind of fit together was still an unknown. And then there's the human component. So people were egging and kind of taking more than they needed. Also just the general harvest of adult birds, and then degradation of habitat through ATV use and just general human sprawl. So some conservation measures were put into place. One of the first things they did was they banned lead shot. So that happened in the early 90s, around that 1993 mark, actually. And then they, through the Endangered Species Act and the Migratory Bird Act, they banned hunting of eiders and also the ability for people to egg. And then, of course, huge research efforts started being put into motion. So they had no idea where these species wintered. They had no idea, what the breeding population was doing. They had just started doing some monitoring in 1991. So, there wasn't a lot of information at all about the species. So a large amount of research started happening. And so I don't know how much you guys know about eiders in general, so I was gonna do just a little bit of background. But they are a sea duck, and most sea ducks tend to be a long-lived bird. So these birds can live upwards of 30 years. We had most of the birds that we were working with were 26 to 32 was kind of that range that we were dealing with. So they can live for a very long time. And they are not breeding until they're 3 or more years old. So that's something that it's kind of complex when you start to think about doing analysis on these species and what that means for birds that are coming back and things like that. They are also a species that lives in freshwater and marine habitats, and they're actually spending a majority of their time at sea, anywhere from 9 to 11 months of their life. And so they actually have salt glands that allow them to live in these harsher environments and kind of filter out some of that nasty stuff that can be in the water and allow them to live in the ocean for so long. So their breeding habitats, this is a really weird slide, but we have Arctic Russia is one of their breeding areas, the North Slope, and then the YK Delta. And so when they talk about recovery, and when they start to set goals for the species, all three of these breeding areas have to meet those goals in order for this species to be delisted, and that's one of the challenges. Lisa?
What are the dots? What do the dots mean?
So I think this is just concentrations of eiders in different spots. Oops, I'll get into that. But it's showing molting areas. It's just different species that they used satellite tags. So this is different species found throughout molting areas. This is a molting area, molting area, molting area, and then this is a wintering ground. So they actually winter south of St. Lawrence Island, and this is the entire population of speck eiders come here for the winter. And so it's just this huge mass of ice, essentially, and this is taken during one of the winter surveys, so they will go out and actually survey the birds in the winter to get a population estimate. And the birds are sticking to the open leads in between the sea ice. And one of the reasons for that is that it allows them access to food sources that are actually underneath the ice. It allows the birds to get up here and roost if they need to conserve energy. And then it also, with the large storm tides and stuff that are happening, these leads are actually super protected. So that's another reason why they're kind of honing in on those spots. So once the weather starts to warm up, these birds are heading back to their breeding ground, which is usually around April or May. They're showing up in pairs. And
what can we feed them when they're in the...
There's little invertebrates and stuff that are underneath, and crustaceans, that are underneath.
So it's fairly shallow in there.
Yeah, I mean they're just going right underneath the ice, and they're feeding off of the ice.
Of the ice.
Yeah, so they will shift with the ice pack, and yeah, so it's kind of interesting. They'll show up to their breeding grounds in April or May, and they're coming in pairs. The females are super duper site faithful. Not only are they coming back to the same general area, but sometimes they'll come back to the exact same nest pool or really, really close. So it's really interesting with a bird that we've been studying for 20-some years to see where she's ended up over the course of that time. It's usually pretty close every year. As far as their eggs, their clutch tends to be about 4, but they can have anywhere from 3 to 9. And they tend to be this really beautiful olive green color. And incubation tends to be about 24 days. And after 24 days, you get this cute little guy. And within 2 days, these guys are walking, feeding, and doing everything on their own. After about 30 days, they're starting to transition from a freshwater system into a more marine-like system, and after about 2 to 3 months, they're actually fledging and moving on. So it's a pretty tight turnaround. Predators include Arctic fox. Red fox has become kind of a big deal now because they're actually pushing out Arctic fox, and then Jaegers and gulls. This is a gull actually eating a baby scow. But again, the predators tend to focus on eggs and ducklings. They're easy to get. Once in a while, they'll go for an adult, but it doesn't happen very often. And again, that cycle of what is this cycle and how is it working? There's still a lot of unknowns revolving around that. So now I'll kind of move into some of the Eider research that I helped to conduct over the years. And so the study area that I'm going to kind of focus on, this is the Yukon Delta National Wildlife Refuge, and then this is the study area. It's called Kattegat Island, which is part of this larger, this whole area is just Eider mecca. So this is just one area, but it's super high concentrations. We had really, really high densities, some of the highest densities on that coast, which is why it was chosen. So again, kind of a zoomed in version. This island is 32 kilometers square, so not super big. There we go. Welcome to the island. And again, it's these salt marsh flats, large expanses of ponds, and really flat area. Tidal sloughs, huge tidal sloughs that cut through the island or would cut through our plots that we were walking. So that's something very similar to here, where we had to be very aware of what was happening with the tides. Otherwise you could get stuck and not be able to get back to camp. So, but it added an interesting component to the island, having this tidal influence versus areas of the island that were not tidally influenced. And so the main reason we were on the island, we have 20 years of adult annual survival that we've collected, over 20 years at this point. We were also focusing on nest success, duckling survival, and then recruitment, so the number of birds that were coming back into the population. And so we would arrive on the island sometimes super early in April, where breakup hadn't occurred and everything was completely snow covered. And the purpose of being out there was to document the migration and who was coming in when. And so we would spend days walking the island and just watching it slowly change into this landscape where once those terraces started to open up, the birds were on it. And so for us, when black brant showed up, we knew what was happening. As soon as the black brant were there, everybody else showed up within a few days. And what was amazing about this system is that it would take a couple of days once breakup occurred, the entire island would drain. And that one day there's ice and snow, and the next day it was all gone. And it's just this muddy terrace. And then later in like May, June, July, it starts to look like this. So our field crew was pretty small. We tried to keep it to 4 people, so we weren't having a huge impact on this area. It was super dense with birds, and we wanted to have as little disturbance as possible. So we would arrive by float plane typically, and if it was early in the spring, like that pre-breakup, we would sling a lot of stuff in with the helicopter. Stocking up really good. We were really, happy, and if we ever ran out of supplies, the guys would bring in airdrops, so we would get mail and food, but they hadn't quite figured out how to do milk, eggs, or ice cream.
Yeah.
So, we had to do without some of those things that could be dropped from the plane. And so the main purpose of us being out there was to monitor these plots. And so there were 45 of them that we were searching for spectacle eiders primarily, but we would also look for common eiders as well. And then we had a few black brant colonies that we were monitoring. We had some long-term data sets that we would go through the colonies and monitor them as well. So we were super busy. And so with the plots, we were thoroughly searching them at least 2 times. We would try to do it early on in May to get the early nesters, and we would try to do it again in a couple of weeks to get those late nesters, so that we had this really nice span of the nesting that was happening on the island. So hopefully we caught everybody within 2 searches.
What's that yellow thing?
It's a nasal disc. I'm going to get to that. So it's something that we attached to them so that we could read it from far away and you wouldn't have to disturb the bird quite as much, but they're kind of controversial, so. And so there were 3 things that we were interested in when we were searching these plots. One was finding an eider on the nest, typically, is where she was. So we were interested in the female herself. We were interested in the eggs, and we were interested in the nest. And so with the female, when we would approach, she would typically flush, and we would look to see if she had bands. So this one has 5-4K. She also has a nasal disc that we were able to read at that time too. But we were trying to see, is she marked or not? If she's marked, we try to read the bands, and if she's not, we mark her off as someone that we want to come back and trap later on in the season. So at this point, they had been banding birds since 1992. So we had hundreds and hundreds of records. And there were very few birds that we hadn't marked, but every year we got about 20 new birds. And so it was just something that the recovery team, to get survival estimates and all of that, we needed to be collecting that type of data. Also interested in the eggs. So once the female was pushed from the nest, we would look at the eggs, we would mark them. So later on we could come back and so we marked them, we numbered them. We could come back on subsequent visits and see if anything happened. We would age the eggs, and one of the methods we use is floating, where you take the egg and you put it in water, and depending upon the angle of it, you can get an estimate on age. We would also candle the eggs, which is a little more difficult to do and takes a lot of practice, but it gives a better estimate on the age of that egg. And then what we would do is we would backdate. So once you figure out how old that egg is, you subtract it, figure out the number, you figure out the initiation date of that nest, and then we would take it times so many days to figure out when the estimated hatch would happen. And the estimated hatch was important when it came to capturing, because we wanted to make sure that those females were still on their nest, and later in incubation they sit super duper tight, and it's less likely that they're gonna abandon. So we want to, there's like this very small window where we can actually do the capturing before it gets to be kind of crazy. So one of the ways we captured them was with mist nets, where it just has one giant pocket, and you stretch it out between two people, you walk towards the nest, and then you just lay it down on top of the female, and usually she just kind of sits there, and eventually she figures out like something's going on, and she'll just jump right into the nest. And at that point, we kind of process her, we get her out of the net, which doesn't take terribly long. It's actually super duper quick. The other method that we use is bow trapping. This is actually an emperor goose nest when we used to do avian influenza. But we would use bow traps as well, which with the Eiders, we would actually take out the eggs and we would replace them with dummy eggs so that they wouldn't break their own eggs. Because we didn't have permits for that, and we were only allowed to, damage the species so much, and they wanted none of that to happen. So with a bow trap, you set it up around the nest. It has this triggering system, which for us was just this nail that was attached to a 100-foot line of string. You would set the trap, and then you would just wait and wait. Sometimes it would be minutes, sometimes it would be hours before the female would come back. And you pull the string, the bow trap snaps over her, and then we're able to process. So there's a pretty lady right there. And with processing, we would weigh the female, we took Coleman length, we took tarsal length, and then we would give them bands. And so metal band and tarsal band were pretty common, and they were using these nasal discs as well, which I did not like them, and they were really great for identification, especially when we started doing brood captures. It was so easy to identify a female when they had this on their face, but doing some analysis on it, the retention wasn't very good. And
the bands would break,
the nasal bands would break because they're living in these super harsh winter environments, and so they would get replaced a lot, and it can start to damage their nasal cavities over time, especially if a female's had more than one nasal disc. And so once that was brought to the recovery team's attention, they're kind of like, yeah, we probably shouldn't do that anymore. And so we ended up we stopped using these. As awesome as they were for certain things, overall, I just felt like they weren't the best mechanism. And so, we'd have to kind of push the female, but if we spent enough time, you can capture that number pretty easily with a camera or just by visually watching for a while. And so after all this is happening, we have hatch, which is one of my favorite times of year. So these are pintails, and we have Capanese, and we have Vancouver geese, and black brant, and the island is just like full of all these babies, and it's just really, there's a common eider. And so the last thing that we do at this time is we go back to any nest that we found, and we look for that final nest status. And so with this nest, we were able, we found 6 membranes, and so we looked back at the data. Yep, she had 6 eggs. All 6 membranes were there. We can call that a successful nest. And so this is what some of our data looks like when I would plug it in. We have all these nest locations. Green are spec eider successes, and red are failed nests, which can be abandoned. Sometimes they were depredated or something else happened.
Where was your camp university?
So it was right here, because this is the largest lake, as you can see on the island, and the floatplanes could access this really nicely. But it was really super tricky to land, and the wind had to be right, and the ceiling, the visibility had to be right, and we hardly ever had the conditions. And so we actually ended up moving our camp over here onto this terrace, which was trickier, but we could then bring our stuff from the coast, boat our stuff up. It was just,
So what are the dimensions you get, north to south, and then?
It's 32 kilometers square. So I can't remember how many miles that would be this way and this way, but.
Are you walking?
And we're walking it. Yeah, everything, we're walking to everything. And so we would kind of cutie. We would kind of focus on, you can see that a lot of the nests are in this general area, which was true in most years. This was kind of the hot spot. This was the hot spot. And then this was kind of off and on, good or bad.
These were all in the plots.
These are all in the plots, yeah. And sometimes they're right outside the plot, but they're all within plots, And so we would go back, we would leave the island for a while, and then we would come back in July, late July, early August to do brood captures when the birds were around 35 days of age, is what we were kind of shooting for. So this is a 30-something-year-old, 30-day-old little guy, spec eider. And so with the brood captures, what we were doing is we were pretty much walking the landscape and just looking for birds. You can see how far we're spread out. Like there's a dude over there, a dude over there. And and these ponds are everywhere in between, and we would just radio to each other, hey, I have a brood on pond. And we'd walk over to that person, and we would just capture broods that way. And once we found a brood in a pond, we would set up these mist nets. And so with the mist nets, we would sink them as far into the substrate as we could get them, so the net was all the way to the bottom, because the birds did tend to dive. And so we would just gently push them, and as long as the mama bird went in, the babies would follow, and then they get tangled, and we'd just run, untangle them, get them into crates, and then we'd start processing. And so with the processing, very similar to the adult females, were Wayne, Coleman, Tarses. We'd actually do the 9th primary. And then we were banding all of the birds, giving them a metal band. And so the question then became, why are we doing these brood captures? And one of the reasons was to get at that recruitment. So how many birds are actually coming back to the island? And the other was to look at duckling survival. So they did a 10-year analysis, and they were finding that we banded all of these ducklings and nobody was coming back. And we started digging into it more, and wow, man, their weights are really low. They're probably not surviving. And very rarely, I think we got like 8 recoveries out of 100 and some odd birds, which is, and who knows, they don't come back for 3-4 years, sometimes it's 6 years, so the data is kind of messy anyway. But we were wanting to kind of answer some of those questions, and so what we ended up doing was we brought on a graduate student to kind of look at some of the habitat data. So he expanded off of the data that we currently had, but then he was looking at brood movements and activities, as well as habitat use, habitat availability, and then pond conditions across the island. And so Pete's gonna recognize this thing.
Nicholson Tower.
Yeah, this is a Mickelson Tower.
Sells a little less than the Trump Towers.
Pete Mickelson built a bunch of towers out on the Delta in the 70s.
And there's still.
And this one's still standing. And it was actually something like we thought about, like, man, those towers are so awesome and we need something for brood captures and how are we gonna do it? But, you know, we didn't have driftwood and we didn't really have people that were super like builders and stuff, so we ended up getting some, you know, towers from Cabela's, but you know, not quite as good as Pete's towers, but they worked. And so we spent a lot of time in these towers during the brood season, documenting activity of the broods, and then actually going out and sampling the ponds for invertebrates and salinity and all sorts of other environmental characteristics to look at this dynamic between what was happening in the system and how it was influencing duckling growth. And then what was kind of interesting is that this little family of Eiders, this is a super, super shallow pond. I mean, like so shallow, super saline, but there were bugs all over, and they were just skimming just on the surface. They would just kind of open their mouth and just skim. And we noticed that that was an activity that a lot of them did, which we thought, wow, that's really interesting. Because these guys are pretty small too, so a lot of interesting stuff came out of that project. And along with some of the habitat stuff, we decided to do data loggers. This is a tidally influenced pond that right now it's low, but it fills up with water, and when it fills up with water, we get these guys on it, which was super cool. Lots of eiders. We had a few Stellar's eiders that visited, and it was always on this pond. So what was so special about it, I'm not really sure, but that was pretty cool. And then we also put data loggers in closed systems and the freshwater systems. And one thing we wanted to look at was the storm tides that influenced the island. So in 2011, there was a huge system that came through in November, and it went 13 miles inland. So the water just came up and over, completely covered this island. And in 2012, when we came, it was just a mess. There was just pieces of terrace ripped up and deposited in places it had never been, and the water levels were all wonky in the ponds, and the salinity had changed. So we wanted to start to kind of monitor these huge events that were happening and seeing if we could actually record them or not. And then trail cameras. So the last couple of years I was there, we had Arctic fox that decided to join us, and it was a very controversial thing. People wanted them dead. I said, hey, we don't know anything about them, and you want information on predator-prey, let's just throw some cameras up and learn some stuff about this species. And so we put trail cams on their den sites, and we got all sorts of just crazy footage, but you know, they did a lot of maintenance of their dens. And then, you know, with their pups, as their pups grew up, there was a lot of playing and a lot of grooming and a lot of teaching them different, you know, behaviors. And then, of course, there was, you know, the whole killing of birds and bringing them back. But what was interesting is that there was definitely this shift from eggs to goslings to adults. They very rarely took adults. I think it was just an opportunistic thing, but we would go and monitor their dens, and I mean, super opportunistic. I mean, cacklers were everywhere, and that was the primary source of food, were cackler goslings. I mean, they did take gulls, they took pintail. Very rarely, you know, it was thought like they are honing in on eiders, maybe two, you know, like very rarely. So definitely not like honing in on one species, very, very opportunistic. So back to the eiders, what we've found, this is the most recent, so this went from 1995 to 2016, looking at nests, looking at eggs, we're seeing this general kind of upward trend. So they're doing all right. And what they've been finding through aerial surveys and through this monitoring effort and some of the other monitoring efforts that are occurring on the YK Delta is that the population is increasing. They do have these fluctuations, highs, lows, but overall they're starting to reach the mark that the recovery team is kind of hoping for recovery, which is around 6,000. breeding pairs, and so they're getting really close to that. So they have been starting to talk about delisting. But it's one of those things, again, where all of the breeding sites have to be on the same page. And so everybody's not quite there yet.
Well, like in Russia, it wasn't lead shot that was the issue there, or was it?
They are finding that it's not necessarily lead shot, but it's definitely humans taking birds when they're not supposed to be. So they have a little bit more of an issue with like that whole outreach and stuff where people are actually shooting eiders just to shoot eiders, and they have a really high predator rate, a lot more fox, and they have a lot more issues with take of eggs and stuff like that. And
More.
yeah, and their nest success is a lot lower than ours, which is interesting.